The screen flickered to life in a dimly lit room buried beneath Langley. The coffee was stale. The fluorescent hum overhead gave the morning a migraine edge. But the junior analyst barely noticed. His fingers danced over the trackball, zooming into the satellite feed with practiced indifference. It was just another pass. Another stitched mosaic from the newest American toy in orbit, the KH-11 Kennan reconnaissance satellite. Nothing ever happened over Kazakhstan. Until it did. As the image resolved, the analyst paused. Something was wrong. A rectangle of soil too perfect. Tracks barely visible spidering from a central point. The contrast adjusted automatically, sharpening the shapes. 1, 2, 3 recessed structures aligned like clockwork. The signature was unmistakable, even if the site wasn't supposed to exist. A new Soviet missile complex, hidden, half-built, not even operational yet, and now exposed. Within 24 hours, the image would trigger a cascade across the U.S. intelligence community. CIA techs pored over shadow angles and concrete shadows. NSA analysts traced matching supply convoys from weeks earlier. NORAD quietly updated threat vectors. And at the White House, a new nuclear targeting priority slid across a secure table without a word. For years, Soviet commanders had relied on a simple assumption. If it wasn't seen from above, it didn't exist. But the KH-11 didn't blink, and this time, the shadows had betrayed them. Before the U-2, the sky belonged to secrecy. Before the SR-71, altitude meant safety. But now, a satellite hundreds of miles above Earth had become the most dangerous pair of eyes in the Cold War, and those eyes had just cracked open the Soviet Union's deepest vault. The age of satellite war had begun not with a bang, but with a photograph. In the late 1970s, the U.S. intelligence community was operating on borrowed vision. The U-2 had already pushed its luck, and the downing of Gary Powers in 1960 confirmed the risk. Every overflight was a potential diplomatic disaster. The SR-71 Blackbird, though invincible at altitude and speed, was too valuable and too visible to be used over Soviet territory without consequence. Satellites existed, yes, but they were crude. Film-based Corona satellites captured stills on rolls of analog film that had to be ejected in capsules and recovered mid-air by aircraft. Days, sometimes weeks, passed before an image could be analyzed. By then, whatever the Soviets were doing was already over. The Kremlin knew this, and they mocked it. In Pravda editorials and internal defense briefings, Soviet military leaders dismissed America's reliance on optical gimmicks. A satellite that couldn't respond in real time was just a camera in the sky. Predictable, slow, easily fooled. They weren't entirely wrong until KH-11 launched. Nicknamed Kennan, in tribute to the architect of containment, the KH-11 was nothing short of revolutionary. It replaced physical film with electro-optical imaging, capturing digital visuals and transmitting them directly to ground stations via encrypted relay satellites. It was, in essence, the world's first space-based live video feed. But even inside Langley, skepticism remained. Many within the CIA and NSA questioned whether KH-11's technology would truly change the game. Could it operate in cloud cover? Was its resolution actually sufficient? Could it differentiate between a tractor and a TEL transporter erector launcher? The first few months offered little more than grainy stills, some even worse than earlier film. The Soviets, watching every American satellite launch with their own radars, dismissed the KH-11 as a telescope with an ego. Their assumption, it was an expensive gamble one the U.S. couldn't afford to get wrong in an era of inflation, budget cuts, and political exhaustion after Vietnam. Meanwhile, Soviet doctrine shifted to exploit America's limitations. They constructed underground missile silos masked by civilian structures. Launch pads were built in areas of perpetual cloud cover. Key test facilities in the Arctic Circle were scheduled for activity only during times when U.S. satellites were predicted to be on the opposite side of Earth. American analysts, despite better tools, were always half a step behind, until one morning the KH-11 sent back an image that didn't wait for film, didn't depend on weather, and didn't care where the Soviets hid. It was a photograph no spy plane had captured, no drone had seen, no analyst had predicted. The Soviets had laughed. But the KH-11 was now staring through the fog of doctrine pixel by pixel, frame by frame, and it would not be ignored again. Soviet military doctrine was not just a set of strategies, it was a mindset, a deeply entrenched belief in camouflage, compartmentalization, and control through denial. For decades, the USSR had built its missile infrastructure on three pillars: dispersion, deception, and denial. Disperse launch facilities across vast territories, deceive foreign reconnaissance with decoys, fake roads, and camouflage nets. Deny real-time intelligence by exploiting the time delay in enemy surveillance systems. This doctrine worked until the KH-11 made time a liability. The Soviets had spent the 1,960 seconds and early 1,970 seconds learning from each failed American overflight. They built missile fields in areas with persistent cloud cover, such as Siberia and Kazakhstan, knowing that older satellites using photographic film couldn't penetrate those layers easily. They constructed decoy launch pads and command bunkers. Mobile missile units practiced in remote forests where the tree cover was nearly impenetrable to high-altitude visuals. The central assumption: no satellite could react in real time. That was true until it wasn't. KH-11's design shattered this logic. Its electro-optical system was capable of capturing high-resolution imagery and relaying it within seconds to ground stations. Analysts didn't have to wait for recovery capsules or weeks of film development. The window of deception, once measured in hours or days, had collapsed to mere minutes. And worse for the Soviets, the KH-11's ability to revisit the same location multiple times per day meant that even well-timed camouflage operations had a drastically reduced chance of success. The old tricks, fake canvas hangars, mock missile convoys, optical illusions designed to fool static photography were no longer enough. A KH-11 image taken in the morning could be compared to one taken that same afternoon, revealing changes in layout, movement patterns, or temporary concealments with damning precision. Worse still, the Americans weren't operating the KH-11 inches isolation. They were cross-referencing matching infrared signatures, signal intercepts, and even human intelligence to KH-11 visuals. A previously empty stretch of ground, when overlaid with intercepted radio chatter and thermal discrepancies, suddenly became a target of interest. Soviet generals had spent decades building an empire of shadows, but the KH-11 brought a new kind of light, a light that wasn't blocked by clouds. That didn't need pilots. That couldn't be outrun or jammed. It was orbiting silently overhead, every 90 minutes. And with every pass, it was peeling back a layer of the Soviet Union's carefully managed illusion. A doctrine forged in secrecy was about to be undone by something the Soviets never truly understood: the truth, transmitted in real time. It started with a pattern, not a missile, not a silo, just a disturbance rows of soil unnaturally symmetrical, carved into a remote patch of steppe near Tyuratam, Kazakhstan. At first glance, the KH-11 image appeared mundane, but to trained eyes at the National Reconnaissance Office, it was a signature. A shape too clean, angles too straight, vegetation displaced in a way that suggested heavy machinery, not agriculture. An analyst zoomed in. There, 3 longitudinal trenches, a security perimeter forming, and faint indications of reinforced concrete being poured. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Construction was in its early phase. No missile launchers, no gantries, no fueling equipment. But that was the point. For years, the CIA had assumed this sector was dormant, scouted by U-2 seconds in the 60 seconds, regularly photographed by earlier satellites with no sign of strategic activity. It was the kind of location analysts filtered out after 100 cold passes, until the KH-11 caught it in the act. Over the next 10 days, the satellite revisited the site multiple times, With each pass, more details emerged. New utility roads, underground cable lines, radiation shielding structures, and a buried dome that matched U.S. projections for mobile IRBM launchers. Langley's assessment was chilling. This was not just a missile site. It was a first strike platform under construction, built to operate from concealed bunkers and launch with little to no warning. And it wasn't on any American map. The CIA scrambled to overlay the new images with intercepted Soviet engineering logs and rail schedules. The pieces aligned. Materials had been shipped under civilian cover. The site's construction had begun months ago, using labor units registered under agricultural projects. The KH-11 had caught the Soviets mid-lie. Washington's strategic calculus changed overnight. This wasn't just a facility, it was a doctrine shift, an attempt by the USSR to deploy its missile capability deeper, faster, and in more survivable configurations. And the only reason America knew? Because the KH-11, orbiting silently above, had happened to look at the exact right moment in the narrow window before camouflage netting was installed, before radar masking was completed, before the site could vanish from view. It was the first time the U.S. had proven that real-time reconnaissance could outpace Soviet deception. The impossible had happened. A Soviet missile complex, previously undetectable by every known intelligence method, had been exposed not by boots on the ground or by a plane in the sky, but by a satellite camera, tens of miles above the Earth, catching a shadow that should never have existed. When the image reached the upper echelons of Soviet military intelligence, the first reaction wasn't panic, it was denial. GRU officers reviewed the reports, compared them to internal construction timelines, and dismissed the American claim as bluff. Their assumption: no foreign system could have detected the site in its current state. It was too early, too incomplete. The camouflage hadn't even been deployed yet. There was no way the Americans could have known. But the Americans had known. And worse, they had proof. The CIA didn't go public. Instead, in a calculated move, they let a sliver of the image leak through diplomatic back channels. The quality was deliberate, clear enough to stun, vague enough to protect sources. It showed the outlines of the facility, exact enough to remove all plausible deniability. The Soviet response was swift and frantic. Within days, KGB counterintelligence units descended on the Tyuratam region. Construction teams were interrogated. Internal audits launched. Engineers grilled. The initial suspicion wasn't technology, it was treason. The KGB believed someone had talked. Only weeks later, after sweeping the entire site for listening devices, aerial drones, or human agents, did the reality begin to set in. There was no mole, no leak, no insider, just a satellite. It hit the Kremlin like a cold slap. The KH-11 hadn't just captured an image, it had rewritten what the Soviet Union thought it understood about reconnaissance. They had assumed that satellite visibility could be gamed, timed, or dodged. But this was different. What spooked them most was not what the image showed, but when it was taken. A precise moment in the construction timeline, during a narrow window when the site's activity was temporarily exposed. The KH-11 had nailed it with surgical timing, and that meant only one thing to Soviet planners. The Americans weren't just watching, they were listening, modeling, predicting, using a fusion of signals intelligence, behavioral analytics, and orbital surveillance to capture critical data in real time. Moscow convened emergency sessions of its strategic rocket forces and the general staff. Entire branches were ordered to reassess dozens of secret facilities. If one site had been seen, what else had been compromised? Were mobile missile movements being tracked? Had dummy launchers been identified? Could even silo drills now be monitored from orbit? Panic seeped through command corridors. Not from fear of attack, but from the loss of invisibility. For decades, the Soviet Union had relied on the comfort of shadows, the faith that what was hidden stayed hidden. But now, orbiting far above, the KH-11 had proven something far more dangerous than firepower. It knew where to look. For weeks, Soviet analysts clung to a single hope. The KH-11's success was a fluke, a lucky angle, a temporary exposure, a once-in-a-decade mistake in their otherwise airtight camouflage doctrine. The American satellite, they reasoned, must be in a fixed polar orbit, predictable and avoidable. If they could track its path down to the minute, they could simply suspend construction or movement during those brief overpasses. It was old logic dressed as new strategy, and it was completely wrong. What the Soviets didn't know was that the U.S. had already orbited a second KH-11 on a complementary orbital path, enabling overlapping coverage. While one satellite passed over Kazakhstan in the morning, the second followed hours later. The net was tightening, shadow gaps were disappearing, and even worse, the KH-11 wasn't behaving like a normal satellite. Its orbital parameters were occasionally adjusted subtly, precisely by onboard propulsion. It could fine-tune its altitude and inclination to revisit targets with shocking flexibility. No longer could the Soviets rely on fixed orbital calculations. No more safe windows. No more guaranteed blind spots. Soviet orbital analysts, trained on classical mechanics and decades of predictable U.S. overflights, were suddenly lost in a maze of moving shadows. Their charts, once gospel, became guesswork. Meanwhile, the Americans weren't just watching. They were exploiting the very confidence the Soviets had in their old theories. In one case, a missile convoy was timed to move under cloud cover between predicted satellite windows, but the KH-11, adjusted for a higher angle and supported by infrared overlays, caught the movement anyway. The imagery didn't just show trucks, it showed heat signatures, engine trails, and even the unloading of fuel tanks. The Soviet command still tried to rationalize it. Maybe the KH-11's cameras were faked. Maybe the image was composited. Maybe there was still a leak somewhere. They couldn't yet admit the real truth, that the era of timed invisibility was over. In desperation, one senior planner proposed a return to older concealment methods, burying more facilities underground, doubling the number of dummy sites. But budgets were tight, and the clock was ticking. Every week, the KH-11 returned with new evidence, new exposures, new violations. Their maps were now American targets, their safe zones were American portfolios, and their doctrine, once built on mathematical precision, was unraveling. The KH-11 wasn't breaking their facilities, it was breaking their assumptions. If orbital prediction had failed, perhaps the answer lay elsewhere. A new theory emerged deep within the GRU's counterintelligence division. The Americans weren't relying solely on visuals. Instead, they must be intercepting radio chatter, decoding encrypted signals, or even listening in on secure Soviet telemetry to predict movements. Visual surveillance, the GRU argued, could only go so far. Perhaps it was signals intelligence that had led the KH-11 to that site at exactly the right time. And so, the next phase of Soviet defense focused on signal suppression. Construction zones went radio silent. Mobile launch drills moved without broadcast. Communications were routed through fiber optic landlines rather than satellite relays. Field units were ordered to practice strict electronic discipline, simulating Cold War-era radio silence protocols used in submarine warfare. But even in this eerie quiet, the KH-11 kept seeing. And worse, it began revealing a new kind of Soviet failure: decoy deployments. In one instance, KH-11 imagery captured a seemingly active missile convoy traversing eastern Ukraine. But upon closer inspection, CIA analysts noticed something strange: identical tire wear patterns, uniform heat signatures, and no displacement in local foliage. The convoy was fake, inflatable dummies mounted on trucks, deployed to confuse any potential aerial observer. Except the KH-11 didn't just see the trucks, it saw the pattern, and pattern was something a machine could never unsee. The U.S. began building libraries of Soviet decoy behaviors, movement timings, tire imprints, shadow distortions under high sun angles. KH-11 imagery, combined with AI-assisted photo comparison, an early form of image recognition, revealed that Soviet ghost facilities were just that, ghosts. Moscow had poured millions into fake launch sites, dummy fuel stations, and underground bunkers that led nowhere. But with each satellite pass, KH-11 exposed them not by what they showed, but by what they repeated. Nature was random. Soviet camouflage was not. And the camera caught everything. Desperate to reassert control, Soviet engineers proposed a new wave of deception. Deploy real missiles among the fakes. Blur the pattern. But the logistics proved overwhelming. Maintaining deception at that scale required more trucks, more manpower, more fuel resources that strained even the USSR's hardened infrastructure. By 1982, American analysts had categorized over 40 Soviet facilities as probable decoys, none of which had ever been seen in activity outside of carefully staged moments. The KH-11 didn't just identify threats, it rendered whole regions strategically irrelevant. And with every new image, the old Soviet theory collapsed. The enemy didn't need to hear them, it only needed to watch long enough. By the spring of 1983, a chilling realization had settled across the upper ranks of the Soviet Ministry of Defense. It wasn't just that the Americans had seen one facility, or that their decoys had been spotted. The truth was far worse. The entire Soviet concealment architecture had failed. For decades, Soviet strategic planners had based nuclear deployment and survivability around three principles: redundancy, surprise, and geographic dispersion. Every missile site, command bunker, and rail-mobile ICBM unit was built on the premise that its existence could be denied, delayed, or at least distorted long enough to launch. But now, KH-11 imagery fed to CIA, NSA, and Stratcom was proving those assumptions wrong in real time. One damning example emerged in late April. A KH-11 satellite captured a mobile missile battalion, repositioning near the Sverdlovsk Oblast. The units were previously unknown to U.S. intelligence, believed to be in reserve storage. But the KH-11 didn't just photograph the convoy. It tracked its progress across 3 days, from initial deployment to staging drills. Overlaying the new data, U.S. analysts realized the Soviets had quietly activated an entire second-tier missile deployment protocol, designed to support a retaliatory strike in case of nuclear conflict. And they'd been doing it for years. The failure wasn't in detection but in recognition. Dozens of Soviet units, buildings, rail yards, and non-military industrial complexes had been misclassified by the U.S. Not because they were invisible, but because no one had known what to look for. The KH-11 changed that. A reanalysis of satellite imagery from just 18 months earlier, now reviewed with new parameters, revealed more than 60 strategic assets previously missed or misjudged. Among them, 3 hardened silos near the Arctic Circle, masked under false geologic formations, a civilian rail terminal that doubled as a mobile missile refueling hub, a buried command node near Novosibirsk, capable of issuing wartime orders across all strategic rocket forces. These were not just tactical locations, they were doomsday infrastructure, critical to Soviet nuclear doctrine. And America had been blind to them, until now. Within the Pentagon, the revelations triggered an emergency review of nuclear targeting plans. PSYOP, America's single integrated operational plan for nuclear war, was quietly rewritten. Target priority lists were redrawn. Entire sections of the Soviet Union, once dismissed as low threat, were suddenly elevated to top-tier importance. Inside the Kremlin, the impact was even more corrosive. Reports of American satellite capabilities trickled down through unofficial channels, filtered through disinformation, diplomatic hints, and the quiet resignation of exposed truths. The Politburo demanded answers from the GRU. The GRU demanded miracles from the strategic rocket forces, and none came, because there was no countermeasure, no jammer, no shadow thick enough. For the first time in history, the United States didn't just know what the Soviets had. It knew where, when, and even how often. And the worst part? Moscow never saw it coming. To understand the full impact of the KH-11, One had to leave behind the satellite itself and descend into the vast, interconnected machine. It fed a system built not just to observe, but to react, decide, and control. KH-11 was the eye, but it was just one part of the American intelligence nervous system. Each image transmitted by the satellite didn't float aimlessly into government databases. It arrived with precise timestamps, orbital coordinates, and environmental conditions. It was immediately routed through the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, where specialists performed first-layer analyses, geometry, shadow length, thermal bleed. From there, the data flowed to Langley, where CIA analysts layered it with human intelligence, and SIGINT, signals intelligence, from the NSA. Then it moved to the Pentagon, where Stratcom re-evaluated targeting plans in real time. What emerged was something the Soviets never expected America to possess: an integrated, real-time command and surveillance ecosystem. The KH-11 wasn't about watching missiles. It was about mapping behavior, tracking logistics flows, identifying construction anomalies, detecting sudden forest clearings that hinted at hidden radar arrays or mobile launch pads. And the Americans were not passive observers. By 1981, KH-11 imagery had contributed to the redesign of nuclear war planning software, allowing U.S. missile commanders to retarget ICBMs within minutes, not days. If a mobile launcher was seen moving, its coordinates could be updated into war plans almost instantly. A single image could trigger a National Security Council briefing. An exposed silo might prompt a back-channel warning to Soviet diplomats. A suspicious rail shipment could lead to satellite retasking, aircraft deployments, and fleet realignments in the North Atlantic. The Soviets were playing chess, but the Americans were playing multi-domain surveillance, land, air, orbit, and even sea, integrated through the KH-11's lens. And then came the breakthrough: temporal pattern analysis. U.S. analysts began compiling year-long imagery time series over key Soviet zones, comparing snowmelt patterns, vehicle shadow shifts, and crop disruptions to determine whether civilian infrastructure hid strategic intent. This wasn't espionage. It was anticipation. In one instance, a suspected decoy airstrip was flagged because of grass regrowth patterns inconsistent with aircraft movement. A KH-11 image proved it. No rubber residue on the tarmac. It was a dummy. But 200 kilometers east, another field barely noticed before showed matching tire tracks, heat trails, and the faint outline of buried fuel tanks. The KH-11 pivoted, caught it. A MiG-31 forward operating base, previously unknown, now fully mapped. This level of precision horrified the Soviets. Their best defenses weren't being bombed, they were being ignored. Because the Americans already knew what was real and what was a lie. The KH-11 was no longer a tool of surveillance. It was a weapon of strategic negation, one that didn't need to fire a shot, only observe, catalog, and render the enemy's best assets irrelevant. And that, more than any missile, was the true American power. The test came in 1984. Deep in the Soviet Far East, near a region known as Chita Oblast, the USSR staged a massive military exercise code-named Zapad Uran. The war game was designed to simulate a Western surprise strike and demonstrate Soviet missile survivability under combat conditions. The Politburo needed a win. The GRU needed proof that its concealment doctrine could still operate under KH-11's watchful eye. And so, a dozen mobile IRBM, intermediate-range ballistic missile, units were deployed in secret. Entire forests were leveled to construct impromptu roads. Bridges were reinforced. Decoy launchers were sent in first to bait any observers. The real systems followed 48 hours later under darkness and cloud cover. It was a textbook operation, but the Americans already knew. In fact, KH-11 had imaged the buildup weeks in advance, not through interception, not through human spies, but through soil pattern recognition, subtle wheel ruts, unusual supply deliveries, and the presence of construction crews wearing military-issue boots rather than civilian ones. When the exercise began, U.S. analysts had already designated Zapad-Uran's missile convoy routes, support hubs, and fuel dumps. The KH-11 captured every stage from initial rollout to launch simulation. The humiliation came later. In a closed-door session at the White House, satellite imagery from the exercise was shown to President Reagan. On screen, a crisp, color-corrected mosaic of a Soviet missile convoy halting near a clearing, unloading equipment, and assembling mobile launch pads. Next to it, a time-lapse of the same area 12 hours later, fully camouflaged, hidden from above. Or so they thought. The KH-11 saw through it all. The images were leaked quietly, strategically to NATO allies. The message was clear. Soviet mobility was not survivability. When a sanitized version of the exercise was eventually published by Western media, showing anonymous missile movements in Chita Oblast, the Kremlin reeled. They hadn't just lost a military secret, they'd lost credibility. Internally, Soviet generals were forced to admit what they had long denied, that KH-11 and its successor platforms had rendered a key pillar of their nuclear deterrence vulnerable not through attack, but through precision visibility. Missiles were supposed to disappear after deployment, but the Americans had shown the world they could be tracked like trucks on a freeway. And in war, visibility is death. Some within the Soviet Strategic Rocket Command proposed radical changes, shifting to rapid deployment submarines, abandoning rail-borne launchers, even investing in orbital jamming systems to blind U.S. satellites. But by then, it was too late. The battle had already been lost, not on the steppe, not in the skies, but in the digital vaults of Langley. The KH-11 hadn't just exposed Soviet missiles, it had exposed Soviet thinking. And in a Cold War fought with secrets, losing control of the truth was the most humiliating defeat of all. By 1986, a new specter haunted the Soviet General Staff, not one made of steel or firepower, but of silence. It wasn't what the Americans were saying that terrified Moscow. It was what they weren't saying. Since the exposure of the Zapad-Uran exercise, Soviet intelligence had tracked a disturbing trend. The Americans had stopped reacting. KH-11 overpasses continued. The satellites maintained their orbits, still feeding data back to Langley and Stratcom, but there were no diplomatic protests, no condemnations, no chest-pounding headlines in Western newspapers. The Soviets had expected confrontation. Instead, they were met with quiet confidence. Because the United States no longer needed to posture, they had knowledge, and in Cold War strategy, knowledge meant first-mover advantage. Entire branches of Soviet strategic defense began to atrophy not from budget cuts, but from strategic irrelevance. Rail mobile launchers were reassigned to conventional duties. Camouflage units were merged into civil defense. Intelligence analysts were told to revise doctrine they had once considered holy, the belief that secrecy was defense, that obscurity was power. And yet the KH-11 kept orbiting, watching, waiting. The ideological wound ran deeper than the military one. For decades, Soviet pride had been built on the notion that the West, decadent, disorganized, chaotic, could never match the discipline of centralized control. The USSR's grand strategy had always hinged on managing the battlefield before it began. But the KH-11 proved that the battlefield had already started in space, in code, and in data. It wasn't just that America had eyes in orbit, it was that those eyes were smarter than Soviet doctrine. Worse still, the KH-11 wasn't static. Each new variant improved better resolution, more agile orbital adjustments, deeper infrared capacity. By the late 80 seconds, Soviet attempts to spoof it were failing so frequently that internal memos joked the only effective camouflage left was not building anything at all. That joke turned prophetic. Faced with undeniable surveillance, the Soviets began canceling missile site upgrades. Why build what couldn't be hidden? Why invest in rail systems that were tracked from launch to destination? Why design new decoys if they'd be exposed before deployment? And as the Cold War crept toward its final years, one truth became clear. The KH-11 had done what bombs couldn't. It had broken faith not just in the strength of Soviet weapons, but in the secrecy that once made those weapons fearsome. In the end, the satellite's victory was not measured in craters, but in concessions, in the way Soviet planners stopped trusting their own terrain, in the way missiles stayed in silos for fear they'd be seen, in the way a photograph, not a warhead, became the most destabilizing weapon in the American arsenal. The KH-11 never dropped a bomb, but it destroyed an empire's illusion of control. Today, few remember the designation KH-11. Its name rarely appears in documentaries. There are no Cold War monuments dedicated to it, no museum displays showing its lens or control module. Yet it changed the shape of global warfare more profoundly than most bombers, tanks, or fighter jets ever could. Its legacy lives quietly in every drone strike, in every GPS-tracked convoy, in every live satellite feed that military commanders now treat as routine. It was the KH-11 that normalized seeing everything, everywhere, all the time. Its ghost floats silently above us still, in the form of modern reconnaissance constellations. Faster, sharper, and automated by AI systems that don't sleep. But the soul of the KH-11 endures not in hardware, but in the doctrine it killed. Gone are the days when armies could vanish into forests, when missile sites could be tucked beneath false farms or sealed under stadiums. The age of strategic invisibility ended not with an invasion, but with an image, a square of terrain frozen in grayscale, decoded by machines, and transformed into certainty. For the Soviet Union, that certainty was fatal. They had mocked American satellites as science projects, dismissed them as passive, as toothless, as mere flying cameras. But they were wrong, because in war, the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that strikes. It's the one that knows where to strike, and when. The KH-11 didn't start the Cold War, but it quietly ended it, one picture at a time.